Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 5th virtual Diverse Ed event. My name is Hannah Wilson. I'm here with the co-founder of Diverse Educators, Benny Carver, to host a morning of panels for you all. Today's theme is the theme of belonging, and we have 4 panels with 5 speakers on each unpacking this theme. So panel 1 is all about diverse children. And let me introduce to you our 5 speakers. Artemi is the director of the Centre for Studies on Inclusive Education. Jack is the head of education at Diversity Role Models. Temi is the founder of Inclusion Labs. Lois is a history teacher and the lead for diversity, equality and inclusion in her school. And Kahir is a teacher in a special school, and he's speaking on behalf of Lifter, our partner, all about how he uses Lifter in his teaching. So welcome to panel 1 speakers. Artemi, can I welcome you on as our first speaker, please?
Thank you very much, Hannah. And a very warm welcome from me as well to everybody who's online here now listening to us, and to anybody who might want to be listening later on from the recording. So my name is Artemi Sakellariadis, and I am a trained teacher for children with special educational needs. And right now I'm heading up the Centre for Studies on Inclusive Education, CSIE, which is a national charity that works to promote equality and reduce discrimination in education. Today, I want to talk to you about how education practice is out of sync with national and international law. And I want to explore how it has come to be this way and present an alternative model, which is already successful in other parts of the world. So first, I want us to look at national and then international legislation. I'm sure we all know about the Equality Act, and it places a duty on schools to make reasonable adjustments in response to people's impairments in order to create equality of opportunity. And this is an anticipatory duty. That means that we have to act now. We don't have to wait until a disabled child knocks on our school's door. What we need to do is review how our schools function and support schools to build capacity to support disabled children's learning and development. So change, fundamental change, radical change is needed. The Children and Families Act confirms every child's right to a mainstream education. And the Code of Practice explicitly states, this surprises some people, but it does, paragraph 1.26, it explicitly states that the law presumes that all children and young people will be educated in a mainstream school. And there are international laws as well, which are relevant to us here. So the Unconvention on the Rights of the Child, it protects all children from discrimination, and it too suggests that all children should go to their local school. And this is clarified further by a number of different general comments that the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which examines how the convention is implemented in different countries. The committee has published a number of general comments, and number 9 is the one that is, it's about disabled children, and it's very relevant to us here because it does state very, very clearly that inclusive education should be the goal. And it also says that disabled children are facing barriers to their learning and participation and the full enjoyment of their rights, and that the barrier is not the impairment itself, it's not the disability in the convention's language, but it is a combination of social, cultural, attitudinal, physical, and I can't remember what other obstacles which disabled children encounter in their daily lives. And there's also another convention which is even more relevant to us here, which is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And Article 24 is about education, and it too says disabled children should go to, there should be an inclusive education system at all levels, you know, from preschool right through to university, at all levels. There are particular definitions within there that I don't think, I'm just keeping an eye on the clock and I won't have time to go through all of them, but the important thing to say is that it draws distinctions between exclusion, segregation, integration and inclusion, and it clarifies that what it means by inclusion is the fundamental reform that we've already talked about, the kind of, you know, really dismantling the current system and changing content, methods, approaches, structures, strategies, just rethinking how we offer education. So the legal imperative is undeniable. But why are things not changing in practice? So I'd like us to spend a few moments to just think how we've got to where we've got to. And I want everybody to just please don't imagine a group of educators or academics or theorists or anybody sitting around a table debating what kind of education is best for disabled children and arriving at the conclusion that there should be separate special schools. The idea that all children should go to school is an idea that arose in the Western world in the 19th century. And at that time, social values were very different to what they are today. And at that time, disabled people were not thought to have a place in mainstream society and its institutions. So when schools were set up, nobody thought, they were set up for the majority of children, and nobody thought that disabled children should go to school too. And yes, I'm going around out of time. That's how we've got to where we are today, and that's why I suggest that we've actually got here by happenstance more than by careful planning. I'd like to flag up that in England today, the picture is very, very patchy. There are some local authorities that rely on mainstream schools for educating the vast proportions of their children, and there are some local authorities that rely more on special schools, and the difference is increasing, and the difference is by now tenfold. The local authority of Newham sends the equivalent of one child in every 552 to special school, and the Tobay local authority, Tobay Council, sends, as the other end of the spectrum, one child in the equivalent of one child in 57. So it is a tenfold difference. It's massive, and there's nothing in the water. There is no rational reason to understand why these differences exist, and everybody has to comply with the same laws and policies. But the important thing to note is that in other parts of the world, education has transformed, and all children can go to their local school. And Canada is leading the way. In a lot of different school boards in Canada do this. I myself visited the Hamilton Wentworth Catholic District School Board. They closed all of their special schools in 1969, and they've been educating everybody in mainstream schools ever since. And if I can just can I fit in one last point, Hannah?
One last point.
One last point, thank you. We now have evidence of the benefits of inclusion, of inclusion, yes, not integration, of when inclusion is done properly, when disabled children's needs are met in school. And we know that that benefits academically, both disabled and non-disabled children. And we know that all children, disabled and non-disabled alike, also it better supports their social and emotional development. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Artemi, thank you for joining us from Greece. I know that you were worried about the background noise. We heard everything you said, so please don't worry about the background noise. And thank you for starting with the law. I think grounding this in the legal imperative is a great place to start. So thank you so much. Jack, can I invite you to join us, please?
Yeah, fantastic. So good morning, everyone. Thank you, Hannah, Benny, Richard, and everyone at Diverse Ed for putting on another really inspiring event with so many fantastic speakers. Really excited to be here. So my name's Jack. I'm the head of education at a charity called Diversity Role Models, and we use the power of storytelling to help educate for LGBT inclusion in schools across the country. As the theme of the panel this morning is around diverse children, I wanted to highlight some of the gaps and discrepancies we see between the diversity of the young people in our schools on the one hand, and then the representations that they see around them on the other, and perhaps consider some ways that we can better reflect the reality of the diversity of the children that are in our schools. So I'm sure it won't be a surprise to anyone that the families of the children in our schools are incredibly diverse. According to the Office of National Statistics, there are around 33,600 children living with same-sex parents in the UK. 1 in 6 adoptions in England and Wales is to a same-sex couple. Around 15% of children are being raised by a single parent. And yet the representations that we see of different families around us in schools, but also in the wider culture as well, doesn't reflect this reality. Some research by Hopster into representation within kids' TV found LGBT plus representation to be severely lacking, and stereotypes of single mothers to be pervasive in some shows. And this isn't just an issue for LGBT representation either. A report from the Books Trust found that while 33.5% of primary age pupils were from Black, Asian or minority backgrounds, only 7% of children's books published in the last 3 years featured a character of color when that report came out. So there's a clear gap between the reality of young people's lives living in diverse families, diverse communities, and attending diverse schools, and the representation that they see on TV, in books, and indeed within their schools as well, and within their lessons. When we look at some of the data then for secondary age students, or for those who've just left education, there's another gap that we see emerging. So polling has consistently shown that young people are more likely to identify as LG or B than other age groups. And one poll from YouGov even suggested that 1 in 2 18 to 24-year-olds said that they weren't 100% heterosexual. So quite high numbers there. However, the education that young people receive doesn't reflect that reality. Only 22% of secondary students surveyed in our recent Pathways to LGBT Inclusion report said that they learned about LGBT identities at school. And I remember, from my time at school, learning the word gay as an insult before I understood it as a sexual orientation. And this all has consequences. A lack of education, a lack of openness, a lack of positive representation can let negative attitudes foster. Our report found that levels of homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic bullying and language remained worryingly high. And shockingly, only 27% of secondary students felt that their school was a safe place for someone to come out in. So again, we see that gap emerging between how young people identify and hear how safe they feel at school. So given that we've got these clear gaps, what can we do to try and close them? And I think as educators, we have the opportunity to better reflect the realities of our school communities. At Diversity Role Models, we do this through sharing personal stories. And this is something that many anti-racist educators have pointed out has two big educational impacts. I think the first is the positive impact on young people from those marginalized or minority backgrounds, that positive impact of representation, of seeing yourself reflected in your school. We know that schools that educate about LGBT identities have been shown to be schools in which LGBT young people feel safer, happier, more welcome, and feel more part of the school community. So that's the power of that representation and that visibility. But storytelling also, I think, has a second impact, which is around building empathy and understanding among those who may not be from that background. Storytelling has been shown to promote empathy and lead to cooperative behaviors and changes of attitudes as well. There was some research done in the 1960s in the US that saw that using books that featured positive Black role models that challenged negative stereotypes reduced racist attitude amongst white pupils. And we see the same impact on attitudes towards the LGBT plus community when our volunteer role models share their personal stories in the classroom. As one student put it, I didn't used to like LGBT people, but now I've changed my mind. So what I'd encourage you all to do to close those gaps is to seek out greater representation in your books, in your examples, in your lessons, in your assemblies. And there are a wealth of incredible resources available for all age groups really to do this. And you can freely access a load of our volunteers' personal stories in our Role Model Stories video series on our website. And that's a great starting point, but there are loads of materials available. Young people deserve to see themselves and their families represented in their schools. They deserve to feel safe from prejudice-based bullying and language. And if our schools better reflected the diversity of our young people, then we'd be able to close that gap between their reality and the education that they receive. And I think that's me for time, so I will wrap up there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. And I came to your trans awareness training during the week and it was brilliant. I think that the lived experience stories from both adults and children really, really powerful for schools. So thank you so much for sharing that. Temi, welcome to the panel. Your turn.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here with everybody else. So I'm the founder of Inclusion Labs. We work to embed diversity, equity, and inclusion into the personal, cultural, and educational development of every young person. Simply, we want every child to be able to thrive in every environment, but particularly in schools. We recently launched our Decade of Diversity initiative at the end of April, and we now have 40 plus organizations and individuals acting as a coalition to really push the needle on two pledges in particular, the 25% diverse literature in our schools by 2030 pledge, and secondly, the diverse governing boards in our schools by 2030 pledge. And kind of segueing into that, really how that came about to be is kind of tied into the topic and the theme of this virtual. It's about belonging. And alongside belonging has to be awareness. They both go hand in hand. When we talk about diverse literature, you know, a lot of it, as Jack and Artemi have said, it's about that inclusion, it's about that representation and the importance of that, and seeing yourself reflected in the resources and also in the individuals that surround you. But also, I think a key part of that is what we hear a lot about in terms of windows and mirrors. And we use that when we're describing literature, but I think also it works in terms of describing leadership. We need people that look like us or that are like us, that will be inspiring dreaming and we can be aspirational, sorry. But we also need people that don't look like us or aren't particularly like us, maybe, to understand and get us a greater sense of that awareness. So for me, these two things have to go hand in hand. When we started developing Decade of Diversity, it really just started from a simple question: why haven't we moved the needle? We've been talking about this stuff since I was at school 20 plus years ago, and yet here we are still talking about it now. And for me, I felt that a key component of that belonging and that awareness is that top-down, bottom-up approach. Yes, with the literature, the resources we're putting around these children, we want children like my children to see themselves reflected in the stories, to be heroes in the stories. So not just about, you know, the issues that we encounter as underrepresented groups, but also the aspirational aspects of that. You know, my daughter also wants to be a primary character on a fairy tale and so on and so forth, depending, obviously, because she's quite young. But also with the diverse leadership side of things, you know, a lot of times with schools, we're talking a lot about we need more diverse faculty, we need more diverse educators, and absolutely we do. And diversity in its broadest sense, I feel we have this very narrow idea of what diversity looks like. You know, we need more ethnically diverse teachers, tick, diversity, but actually in its broadest sense, we need it, again, simply across the protected characteristics. We need socioeconomic backgrounds, we need representation, we need age representation, people with more recent educational experiences. But the reality is, and if we're being very blunt, the balance we need to see across our faculty probably won't happen in our lifetime, the balance we need to see. But what can and should are the leadership positions, diverse governing boards, senior leaders, and that in of itself is what's going to drive more diversity across our faculty. That in of itself is going to be aspirational for the students in our schools. And so these two things really need to work hand in hand. And so that's why really we set up the Decade of Diversity. I think for me as a member, as you can see, of an underrepresented group or profile or whatever, however you want to describe it, identity, with children who are mixed race, it's really important. But I think, again, in some ways it's very simple and it's very difficult at the same time. A little bit, you know, it's that contradictory nature of this work. But very simply, what do we do, people in underrepresented groups, to give our children a sense of belonging and a sense of awareness? Well, we do things like this. We don't have a secret key to a portal that reveals another world and by which we can push this forward. We do basic things like this. We put great diverse stories in front of them. We make sure that we have diverse leadership represented in front of them. And we're showing that every time she watches a Topsy and Tim, we're watching a Jojo and Gran Gran. Again, having that balance and making sure, and that's just what we really need to do. So with the Decade of Diversity, we're trying to really embed what is a very natural thing for people from underrepresented groups into a structure to support schools, but also telling them that, yes, we do need that to diversify our curriculum and our faculty. And there are great organizations and individuals that are working really hard to do that. But also, whilst we're getting there, there's some very simple things we can do. Let's make space on our bookshelves. Let's make space on our leadership teams. And from that, much else will flow. Diverse faculty, higher literacy rates, better outcomes, better attainment. So many things flow from just these two very essential foundational approaches. Thank you.
Temi, thank you. And Benny and I are proud to be sort of signatories of the Decade of Diversity, and both of our pledges for governance and literature are on the Diverse Ed website. And I think, yeah, the making of the space, absolutely. Thank you so much. Lois, welcome to the panel. Over to you for your input.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, both Hannah and Benny and everyone at Diverse Ed for having me. It's such a privilege to speak with such a range of people this morning. Just to give a bit of an introduction to myself, I'm a history teacher at a rural Norfolk high school, where I'm also leading on diversity, equity and inclusion across the school. And I want to start this morning with a question for you. And just to get you thinking a little bit, this idea of what kind of adults do we want our young people to become? Do we want them to be adults who are passive, who accept the status quo, who just accept society as it is? Or do we want adults who are our young people to become adults who are active in society, who actually are thinking about the things that are important to them, the societal issues that are important to them? And if we want our young people to become active members of society, we need to model and shape that behaviour through education. And we need to be doing it right from the start they enter our school system. We need to show our young people that diversity, equity and inclusion work is strong, and it is not a weakness. It is not something which is woke. It is not something which is a really simple thing to deal with. It's something that actually is real strength. And I think that's something, again, we need to model through the way that we give them opportunities to express their ideas and their thoughts in schools. So the focus of what I want to talk about is this idea of student leadership and actually getting students involved in schools in diversity, equity and inclusion work. And I want to give a bit of context of some of the things that I've done at my school, a few hints and tips of things that have worked, and hopefully empower and inspire you to get your students more active in their day-to-day running of the school and their understanding of the wider world. So I work in a rural, largely white, monocultural Norfolk high school. And a few years ago, about 4 years ago, I had some students come to me, Miss, we want to get involved in some stuff. We want to tackle things like racism, sexism and homophobia in our schools. What can we do? So it was very much an organic thing. We started up a campaigns and equality society, and we started off initially with year 11 students, and then throughout the year, students from other year groups came in. And initially, we were just doing things for Pride Month and LGBT History Month and Black History Month and International Women's Day, all of the kind of obvious things that schools are doing. And those things worked really well. We did form time activities, so raising awareness of different societal issues. And this idea of doing different activities to show them what activism looked like. So for International Men's Day last year, just before we went into the first period of lockdown, we looked at creating a cube of truth. So you might have seen cube of truth in city centres linked to things like animal rights, and people wear a plain mask and they stand there just purely with a sign, and that sign could be a statistic, that sign could be a picture, it could be a quote from somebody. And we just set it up in a place in our school hall. We didn't, in our school outside, and we didn't tell any students that we were going to be doing it. And they came out at lunchtime and they just saw this thing, and they were like, "What's this? What's going on?" And the students came and they looked and they read the information, and it had a massive impact. We focused on International Men's Day for male mental health and male suicide rates, and we had testimonies from some of our teachers, from our head teacher to our science technician, saying about the last time as a male they cried. And it provokes so many discussions within the school community, and it gave students a real example to see what activism looked like, what being active about something you were passionate about looked like. And the idea then is that those students can go out into the wider world and do these things as adults. We need to make sure that when we're doing these things, it's not tokenistic, that actually we are listening to student voice and the things that they are passionate about. We need to make sure we're engaging with those young people who aren't interested in diversity, equity and inclusion work, and we're listening to them and we're finding out, why are they not interested? What can we do to get them active and get involved? And last thing I want to say is this idea of getting students involved in looking at curriculum, listening to them about what they're seeing in their lessons, what protected characteristics are they seeing, which ones aren't they seeing, and then actively acting on that with staff to actually use that student voice to challenge our curriculum, to adapt our curriculum, show the students that we are listening to them. So when they give us information, tell us things they're passionate about and changes they want to see, they actually see it happening, rather than, oh, we've said this in student voice and 3 years on it's not changed. We need to listen to them and we need to show them that actually what they're saying matters, because we want them to be adults that say things that matter.
Lois, thank you so much. I love the practical steps there about making our young people active change agents. Thank you to our audience for their patience there. We seem to have better Wi-Fi in Greece and Switzerland than we do in Norfolk today. I think we managed to, no, don't worry, Lois. I know you've had tech issues. I might ask you to do a blog of what you were going to say as well, just in case people missed anything, but great practical solutions there. And Kahir, as our final speaker for panel 1 for diverse children, we're excited to hear about how you've used Lufta to do this in your classroom. Over to you. Oh, your audio's gone, Kahir. You're unmuted, but we can't hear you. It was definitely working earlier on this morning. Nope. Do you want to leave StreamYard and pop back? Just bear with us, audience, for 2 seconds. Maybe start thinking about the questions you want Benny to ask our panelists. I can see a few questions have come through on the comments. Please do put your ideas, comments and questions there, and Benny's going to scoot them up and then field them back to the panelists in a second. Let's just see whether we can get Kahir back with sound this time. Okay. How are you doing, Kahir?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, darling. Okay, over to you.
I'm so sorry about that. There had to be someone. Cool. Thank you for having me. I think so. Thanks to all the other speakers before me. I think you summed up pretty much what I'm about to talk about, which is Lufta. And so, Jack, this might speak to you too, because you mentioned storytelling, which rang a bell in my ears, because Lufta is all about. It's an online lesson teaching platform, and the content they create is story worlds. So it's rich media content, lesson structured content. By that I mean it's very immersive. It's got video, articles, sound, music, etc. So I guess from my perspective, so just a little context about me. I'm a special needs teacher. I teach world studies, otherwise known as humanities. It's geography, history, politics, etc. So teaching special needs kids, one has to really be creative. You have to kind of have use your imagination when you're creating lessons. And so I stumbled across Lufta. Well, the school was already using it, but Lufta's been amazing. So I'll just give 2 examples to give you guys an idea, and I would like to hear what you think about this more than me tell you about it. One of the lessons I focused on Lufta was oral history. The kids had no idea. So our kids are their age range are from like 14 to 19. They really didn't have an idea what was oral history. And so I went through the introduction, blah, blah, blah. Sorry. Went through the introduction. Eventually, so the oral history lesson was focused on this lady called Kuchian in Hong Kong, who's collecting stories of her elders, her family members who lived in the village, and people who once lived in the village who have now obviously moved on to the city for working purposes or other reasons. And she was collecting these stories of what her village was like probably 60, 70 years ago. And then you could see the change up until the present time. And as I was teaching that to the kids, they were like, oh, is that even a thing? Like, who would care about that random person's story? But we went through the lesson. Eventually, they understood that everybody has a voice. And whether you're not seeing it on mainstream media or TV, actually, that voice or that story from my next door neighbor or that person across the road, someone actually cares about that. Somebody is actually collecting it. And so I ended that lesson by asking them, could you create your own oral history? Can you go collect a story from a family member, a friend, or someone you're interested in, or maybe just approach someone you know on the road, or for example, the person in your local shop, for example, and just collect an oral history. And it ended up with them producing probably 12 or around 13 oral histories that were absolutely amazing. And I asked them after, how do you feel about that? And they were like, this is brilliant. I never really knew that I could give a voice to my parents. I could give a voice for my neighbor who I really didn't know much about. But just doing this project, this oral history project, I feel like I've given that person agency, some meaning. Their life makes sense to me, or their life has purpose. And by doing, by having like teaching lessons in such an immersive way, and also because they are special needs, you have to get them immersed in what you want to teach them. So Lifter does story worlds. They have something amazing in their story world, which is a 360 video viewing of. So it's a bit like Google Earth, where you can pan around, zoom in, zoom out, but it's a video. It's moving. It's in motion, and they could pan around whilst the video is playing to see all sorts of different things. So to second the oral history one, I went on to do Afghan bread, which was basically looking at a baker in Afghanistan, Kabul, sorry. So the same thing, they were like, why do we really need to know this? So before I even taught the lesson, I asked them to give me their immediate impressions of Afghanistan. They obviously quoted back to me everything they saw in the TV. By the end of this lesson, they were like, wow, I never really knew there are people like us doing regular everyday things in Afghanistan. And so just to wrap up, I would like to say, I would like to finish off on the fact that, like, I think the way we teach our materials, or the way we're teaching our lessons, I think story worlds could be something we should really consider, because it really is a very immersive way of teaching kids. And then I guess I'll finish on the fact that, like, learning for me is all about getting them, first, you have to be curious to want to learn. And by immersing kids in content that they wouldn't otherwise care to look at themselves or be taught, it sparks a curiosity, and now they want to know more. So I think Lifter's brilliant for sparking the curiosity in young minds. So I'll leave it there.
Kahir, thank you. And we get asked quite a lot, like, how do you do DEI work with children with SEN? Because it does perhaps take a slightly different approach. And I think that immersion you talked about is absolutely vital. I'm going to pass over to Benny now, who's going to curate the Q&A, and then we're going to finish the panel with your commitments to My Diverse Ed Pledge. Over to you, Benny.
Fab. Thank you, everyone. It's been fascinating listening to you. And there's some real threads coming through around the power of storytelling and how that links to curiosity and empathy. And it's lovely to see that actually within all of our different realms, we've got a sense of connection, regardless of what we're specifying around protected characteristics. We do have some questions in the chat, and I'm going to start with you, Artemi. There was a question, and I guess it's a technical question. You talked a lot about the law, and you talked about kind of the legalities of students with disabilities rights to be in mainstream, and you gave us you cited the UN conventions, and the question has come about whether these rights, according to the UN, are enshrined in British law. Is there a connection, or is there a disconnect there? Can you take us through that?
Absolutely, there is a connection. Thank you. That's a very, very good question. There are two steps. There's a kind of two-tier way whereby you can sign up to a UN convention. So different countries can sign a convention which indicates that they intend to do what it says, or they can ratify it, which means it is equivalent to the local law. And the UK has ratified both the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. On that, I will clarify that there is a interpretive declaration on Article 24. So whereas Article 24 says that all children should go to their local school, there's a reservation effectively that says that the UK government reserves the right, which I think is a bit of an insult, but there we go, reserves the right to send children to a school further away from where they live, if that is deemed to be able to offer the best education for them. But at the same time, it commits to developing more inclusive education so that in future, more children will have access to more schools that can respond to every child's right, every child's, to being in ordinary schools. I'm not sure I've seen much happening about that, but it has been written and it has been confirmed in writing. It is how things stand, at least on paper.
Thank you. And I guess the disconnect is always, what it says on paper and what happens in practice are two very, very different things. And I'm not sure how many, kind of mainstream working teachers have an understanding around this. And I do think there is still that belief, unfortunately, that, our students with special educational needs particularly kind of at the extreme ends, if you like, should be segregated. You hear that in staff room chatter quite a lot. So thank you for sharing that with us today. And moving on to this idea of representation, and both Temi and Jack talked about representation. I'm going to come to both of you on this one for your perspectives. Bex O'Hearn has asked about how do we break that cycle of kind of lack of representation in the senior echelons of our education system to ensure that better representation. And I'm sure you will have seen lots of big organizations who are now saying, we're really interested in diversity work, we're really interested in having a diverse curriculum. And yet if you look at their personnel list, it looks very similar to it did, as it did 10 years ago. So if I start with you, Jack, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and it is a real challenge to be able to break that cycle. Firstly, I think the responsibility of leadership, it is a really important aspect of that, of having that representation at those highest levels, and also ensuring that the people who are in leadership positions are doing everything that they can to include and to drive forward, this work around tackling prejudice-based bullying, increasing representation across the curriculum. I think it's important as well that this doesn't just fall, though, to those teachers who might be from those underrepresented groups or from a marginalized background. It shouldn't just be the gay teacher who has to lead on all of the LGBT work at the school. I think it's really important that we create a culture within our schools where it's every single person's responsibility, from board of governors right through to every member of staff, and indeed the pupils as well. I think, as Lois is saying, getting pupil involvement as well is so important. So I think it is important to have that change in leadership, and have more representative leadership, and allowing people to feel able to be open and to be themselves within those positions. But it also shouldn't just be the responsibility of those people. It should be the whole school that has responsibility for that, and each individual that makes up that school community as well.
Absolutely agreed. It's a joint effort, and quite often the heavy lifting, as we call it, often falls to people with protected characteristics, and that can be slightly wearying after a time to be the pioneers, to be the ones who are championing the cause. Temi, over to you. Any thoughts on breaking that cycle of representation?
I don't know whether my response is going to be a popular one, but ultimately, I think every school positions themselves as inclusive. And what we're really getting to the point here is, okay, but how are you showing us that you are inclusive? We're all saying that we are, but how are you showing us? How is it revealing itself to us? And, you can claim to be an inclusive school, you can claim to be having uncomfortable conversations. But if I, as a Black woman, look at your school's structures, looks at your school's practices, look at your school's board, and it is maybe perhaps all white and all male and all of a certain age, and then I look at the curriculum and it seems to be really heavily European fix or whatever else, it's kind of taken away from what you're claiming to be. I think the simplest and the truest answer that we could say in terms of representation, in terms of leadership, is make space. It is as simple as that. If you have a board and there's 10 of you and you are all male or majority male and you're all white, cisgender, in terms of those types of profiles, you're either going to have to make space for someone else, which means someone has to leave so someone else can join or other people can join. It's really as simple as that. It's about creating spaces for other people to have a chance to lead, to have a chance to share in that. I know it's not a very popular choice, but it's the truth, it's the reality. Inclusion work, DEI work, or EDI work, however you include it, is ultimately about making space for stories, making space for leaders, leadership, making space for awareness and everything else. So in terms of representation, I think it is the harsh reality that to start building what that diversity needs to look like in leadership, sometimes you need to step aside. If you get on a bus and you're sitting in a seat and an old lady comes on and she definitely needs that seat more than you do, you either have to move along or you have to get up. And it kind of works, I think, in the same mindset. So I think it's just about and understanding we have to make space.
That's a really nice way of thinking about it. And, the concept of making space is obviously contentious in that, who loses in this? Who has to kind of give up their seat? And I think that's where people really balk at the idea of kind of making space deliberately. And we had a few questions around staffing and representation. So I hope we've covered some of those around that. And one of the questions that was asked around this, and perhaps actually, and this was a question specifically for you, Temi, just to follow up. How do we know? Is there a place where we can find out whether schools are committed to inclusion? You're a parent. How did you go about finding an inclusive school?
The question. My children are about to start a new school in September, and obviously by my work with Inclusion Labs, a lot of people say to me, "Oh, so is this school the inclusive school? Is this the..." And I said, well, if I based my choices on the inclusive school, I'd be homeschooling my children for life, probably. So in terms of finding out, one of the things that we try to emphasize alongside what Jack was saying earlier about collective responsibility and collective action, but I think a key part is communication and transparency. There's such a lack of that in schools. And actually, that is the best way to tell prospective families and current families how inclusive you are, showing them what you're doing, embedding that student voice, and being, so that communication and transparency, not just externally, but also internally. Again, like some of the other people have been saying about making sure the students are part of that conversation. So for me, in terms of telling, I think that's what it is. That's what we're trying to do with Inclusion Labs, trying to get them to be more transparent and communicate a bit more. A lot of times when we have focus groups with families and students, they say to me, oh, this school aren't really that invested in this work, or they aren't doing anything. And then when we have focus groups with the educators, sometimes of that school, they're saying, I don't know why they feel that way. We're doing X, Y, Z, but are you communicating it? Are you transparent about it? Are you involving them in it? So I think, it's a work in progress. The answer is it's about asking the questions, but we need schools to also reveal the answers through their processes, through their policies, through their practices.
Fab. Yeah, absolutely. I think that idea of communication and transparency, it's not easy. We have to do some work in kind of sifting through the sands of it a little bit. But, there are some schools that are really good at being transparent about it, and we need to kind of signpost those as well. Last questions, and these are to Lois and Kahir before we go on to our pledges. And I must crack through this because Hannah will be cracking a whip in the background if I don't speed it up. So the question came around student voice. People often think of student voice as a bit of a bolt-on, something that's nice to have in a school, but actually, it doesn't necessarily have a huge impact. Lois, is this a kind of misconception around student voice? How do we use student voice to make change in a kind of tangible way? And Kahir, I'll be asking that as well from the perspective of oral histories and what contribution students can make to that too.
I would say I don't think that is a concept. I think actually in many schools, student voice is quite performative. And I think actually we need to ensure that we are acting on what students are saying, and we're giving them chance to talk without us there, without us calling the shots, without us engaging and questioning. Actually, could we do our student voice where they are left with an agenda that they have come up with themselves, and we remove ourselves from that process so they can be open and honest without us there, without us guiding what we want to get from it. And then we actually need to listen. And if student voice is going to work, we have to actually act on what they are saying. Yes, sometimes we will have to filter. We cannot do everything that they want to do. But equally, we need to show them that we are listening and we are acting.
Fab, absolutely. I think you're right. And that idea of leaving them to it, letting them make the decisions, giving them agency, so powerful. Kahir, how does this fit with the idea of oral histories and kind of students making impact and change through this?
Yeah, I am being mindful of time. I second exactly what Lois said. But I think with oral histories and stuff, it's really about giving them agency, but meaning. It's to show kids that actually this isn't just something to pass an exam or, or the national curriculum expects that of you. This is something that shows you that there is meaning to everything you're doing. There is someone out there that cares. So that's in some way it's giving them agency, knowing that they can act upon the world, and somebody out there is receiving of that. So I think in that sense, oral histories is just about creating, it creates meaning, purpose for them. So
Yeah.
I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I think that's really profound and a good place to pause. So in terms of, kind of we always have the My Diverse Ed pledge, and thinking about what we've spoken today, I'm going to challenge you to give me a 1-sentence quick fire pledge, something that you're pledging to do or to consider or to promote in the next few months around your area of expertise. So I'm going to start with Artemi. Can you start us off? 1 quick sentence. What's your pledge?
Yes, I think the pledge is to make sure that we use oral histories of disabled people, make sure their perspective is more shared and more understood.
Lovely. Thank you. Jack?
Yeah, for me, it's about harnessing the power of personal stories to embed empathy, challenge misconceptions, and create that inclusive school environment.
Fab. Thank you. Let's go with Lois.
So my pledge is to be bold, to listen to my students, to act on what they're saying, and especially those students that maybe aren't engaged in DEI work at the moment.
Fab. Thank you. Temi?
I think my pledge will be around collective action and collective responsibility, but intentionally going to other industries and getting them to support educators. They don't need to be doing this all by themselves. So I'm going to keep trying to drive more support around our educators. We were all children once. We're all should be invested in this.
Thank you, Temi. And finally, Kahir.
I think my pledge would be to get my pupils or our pupils to be curious, and curiosity will take them where it needs to.
Lovely, short and sweet, but so powerful. Thank you for that, panelists. It's been fascinating. And handing it back over to you, Hannah.
Yeah, thank you, speakers, and thank you, audience. Really, really provocative way to start the day. Go and put the kettle on. You've got a 15-minute break. We'll be back at 10 o'clock sharp to start panel 2. And I hope the 5 of you enjoy the sunshine today. Thank you very much for joining us.